We're going to do the outline of the shapes and the shadow map of this charcoal study in a graphite pencil. You're using a harder graphite pencil, and that's going to make a very faint line. I'm using a regular graphite pencil because you need to be able to see what I'm doing here. So we're going to start by making a vertical line that's the height of the object that we want to draw. And you'll notice I'm trying to make mine kind of sight size, so it's going to line up. You know, the size of my drawing is pretty much the same size as the photograph appears on the screen. Don't make it any bigger than what you're seeing on the screen, and don't make it a whole lot smaller either. We're now going to use some fractional thinking to consider where our big plane changes fall. So we've got a big plane change here at the bottom of this section. Here's our vertical axis. I'll draw it right through the middle. And so we're thinking about what's this fraction compared to this. Now, I'm honestly having a hard time seeing that, so I think I'm going to start, as I often do, by trying to find my center. And I'm going to actually measure a little bit with my pencil, and I'm seeing the center being right about here. You know, you can measure with your pencil even right on the screen or at a slight distance. So I'm going to find my center on my drawing. I'm going to make sure I actually have the center. It's going to be a little lower than that. You do the same thing. And then we're going to notice that the easiest plane change to find is this one right here, which is a little bit above the center. And having found the center, I can see that this unit here is a little more than a third of the way towards the center. So from here to here, we go down a little, just a hair over a third. So that's this plane change. And this plane change here is about halfway between our center and the bottom. You see that? So we're going to mark this plane change about there. And we've got another plane change here, which is about halfway between these two. So these are our vertical proportions. That's a good place to start. And now we're going to do our lateral proportions. I would say that this knob fits just about perfectly inside of a shape that I would call a square. You see that? So we're going to turn this one into a square. And remember, if you're having trouble drawing a square, you can always check your proportions with your pencil like that. This width here is about what I'm seeing is that the neck starts about halfway between our center axis and the outside of the square. So it goes down about like that. If we carry down from the top of the knob straight down, we get to these little indents here. So we've got to come down to here, and then the outside of this goes out past that. So we end up with the shape sort of like this. And you see how this vertical axis is helping us keep everything aligned. This shape is clearly, based on a circle. I could use a little fractional thinking to get the right dimension, though, if I look. So here's the outside of the circle, and here's the outside of the ball on top. And you see how this distance and this distance are about the same. So we know this distance here to here, and we're pretty much going to double it to get to the outside of the circle. Now, if I'm just sketching this, am I going to make all these construction lines? Probably not, but I'm doing all this kind of thinking instinctively, and I'm trying to make it more explicit for your benefit so you can understand that this kind of problem solving goes into drawing just about anything. And if we continue this line further down, we can see that it's going to, what I just learned is that the what we might call the waist is a little narrower than the knob on the top. So this has to tuck in inside of these lines. And we already located this landmark, so we're going to curve out and around to here. And as usual on a turned form, we're going to notice that the base is just as wide as the belly. In other words, if we drop down from here, that's going to tell us where to put these curves. And here we want to make sure this is round enough. So don't make the bottom too flat. Most of you are going to want to make it much flatter than it is because you know it's on a table. But you want to resist that urge. Notice that the peak of this curve is just a little bit below. So we found this landmark. This curve peaks just a little bit below that landmark, like that. And the only thing we haven't really drawn as a curve yet is the top. So we're going to round this off and we're rounding these corners. It's not really a circle. It's sort of a little bit more squarish than that, and it has this ellipse on the top of it. And very important, oh, this also isn't straight. This curves a little bit. Check your work. One thing that has to happen is that this curve here has to be flatter than this curve down here. This has to be rounder. Now, it would be tempting to want to edit this drawing right now, but the procedure I prefer to use is I edit the drawing after I've done a first shading. Before we do a first shading, we have to do the shadow map. So I'm going to highlight it for you so you can see what I'm drawing. Remember, this object is lit with a single light source, just like the objects that you'll be drawing. And as a result, you can clearly identify which areas are in shadow and which are in light. So this is basically an outline of the shadow map. And that's what we're going to be drawing next. here it gets really hard to see where the light ends because there's so much reflected light, but I'm going to say it's about there. And obviously that's part of the shadow too. So now we don't need to think too much about proportion now. We have our major proportions established. So we're just going to work our way down very lightly and draw these, outline these shadows. And I really like the word mapping for this because the outlines of countries on a map are very sort of random, and you just have to do your best to copy what you see. If you're drawing like a copy of the United States, like nobody knows how to draw the United States. You're just going to sit there and copy the contours as best you can, and that's what we do when we draw a shadow map. So there's that zigzag pattern of the light crossing over form and cast shadows. And here's, now on the cast shadow, we should probably start by looking for the center axis. And then we're going to notice that there's an ellipse on the end and an ellipse here. But these ellipses do not fall on this axis. They intersect it, but the mistake a lot of people make is they draw the ellipses like this. Can you see that that's not what we're seeing? What we have is an axis on a slight angle going up, and then a horizontal ellipse at the end of it, and another horizontal ellipse here that's intersecting the shape right around the waist. Like that. And what I'm hoping everyone notices is that is not the same as this. This is the error that I see a lot of people make, is like they want these ellipses to follow this line, but instead what happens is we've got the axis and then horizontal ellipses down along it. Can everyone see the difference between these two conceptions? Okay. So I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes to get caught up, and I'll be right back. So I'm supposing most of you are right-handed, so I'm going to do my first shading in the right-handed way. First, I'm going to erase any construction lines that are inside my shadows, because you can't erase them after you shade. And then we're going to just shade this direction, assuming you're right-handed, very, very lightly. You're going to notice that the charcoal on this kind of paper leaves a very dark mark. So I kind of hate drawing right-handed, but So the reason we put off editing our drawings until after first shading is because you're going to notice once the darks and the lights have been separated, you're going to read this immediately as a three-dimensional form instead of a series of, it's not going to look like a map anymore, it's going to look like a form. And once your brain sees it as a form, your brain is going to let you know the ways in which the form is possibly distorted. And your brain doesn't tell you that information until it starts to register as a three-dimensional form. So I forgot to mark where the horizon line is. I'm going to do that with my graphite pencil. And then to finish first shading, we're going to do the same moves everywhere that there's strong light. So notice up here, we're not going to shade too close to this edge because there's a big area of halftone between the light and the shadow. Along here, the light is mostly restricted to down near the bottom. Here we've got some pretty strong light. And if you're looking for a pattern, what you're noticing is that we get more light on surfaces that face up than on surfaces that are vertical. So it's a lot easier to get this right if you keep that pattern in mind. And that includes on the background, we've got white. We're going to lighten this whole tabletop, not all the way to the edges of the paper. We're just doing a little study so we can just vignette it and stop shading when we get we can just fade our shading away as we move away from the object. I'm going to switch to my left hand for this part, but I'm still shading in a right-handed direction for your benefit. Lefties should be shading the other direction, as I always point out. So at this point, if you kind of squint a little, look at your drawing, it looks like a form. And when you squint and look at the photograph that we're using as a reference, that looks like a form. And what you're asking yourself now is, are these the same forms or are they different? And I challenge everyone to find at least a couple little things about the drawing that looks different from the photograph and to change them. The most important thing to consider is that we have not made any dark lines on the paper yet. So we've created an illusion of a form without a single dark line. And as a result, if there's something you don't like, look how easy and cleanly it'll erase, especially from this paper. This is like working on a whiteboard. because this is paper that's been primed with a coat of thin acrylic house paint, flat house paint, and if you don't like something, unlike paper that hasn't been toned like this, you can erase very cleanly and completely as long as you haven't pressed hard. So I just dropped this a little bit. And what else do I see? I feel like this edge comes a little bit higher and back to give my form a little more symmetry. I'm not going to make a lot of other alterations to my drawing, but I invite you to take your time and make corrections to yours as needed. I'm just going to boost a couple of my lights so I can see what's going on here a little better. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video and we will resume this on Friday. But I want you to spend the next 5 minutes making your corrections. So having done all our correcting that we need to do on these drawings, we're going to go in and start doing final shading, one area at a time. Before you do that, it's really important that you're really happy with the overall layout. We're committing to things. We're going to press harder, and that means that we are committing to the placements where they are. We're not going to make any more changes. And the great thing about working from a digital reference is we can zoom in on an area and really see what's going on. We're using our charcoal pencil now, the HB charcoal pencil, which we also used for first shading. And I'm noticing, first of all, that it's a little darker under this plane change than above it, and that edge is very sharp. Now I'm going to go through this core shadow, and this is where it doesn't matter if you're left-handed or right-handed. You're going to try to make your lines going exactly the same direction that you see me making them. And I'm starting every line in the darker region of the core shadow, and I'm releasing up into that gray zone of the halftone. And I'm following the curve of the form so that when I get to this outside edge, I'm curving this way. And when we get to this other edge, we'll be curving this way. And in between, we are transitioning just like on a sphere. These are sharpening strokes around this edge. And in order to make this edge soft enough, I just need to release into the halftone a little more gradually so that the lines are sort of extending into that zone. Like that. And you'll notice I haven't touched my reflective light yet, but you can see my reflected light is way too bright right now. So I'm going to start shading the other way down into the reflected light until that's a little more nuanced. And it's a very subtle effect, right? The reflected light is not you never want to exaggerate your reflected lights. While we're up in this zone, we're going to do a little bit with the white. I'm going to clean up my construction lines here, and you'll notice that there's a sort of light disc, an oval for the top. I'm not pressing hard here. It's not facing the light directly. This is the highlight right here. And then I'm going to do a little more, some curving strokes, curving the same way I was curving on my dark shading down towards the dark lines. And the way to think of that is think of like two sets of fingers reaching towards each other but not touching. And that's about it for the top. As you've heard me explain before, the world is, on average, sort of closer to gray than it is to black or white. So when you do a drawing on gray paper, it's basically you have a lot less work to do than when you do a drawing on either black paper or white paper. And since we're so used to white paper, sort of the default color of paper, it's a little weird to think of it as an extreme, but white is a very extreme color. And when you're trying to do a rendering of the world on white paper, you're just creating a lot of extra work for yourself that you don't have to worry about when you're working on gray paper. It's like the drawing's halfway done already. So as we move down the form, if your shadow map is a little too dark, this line, you can always go back and erase it. And this is basically going to be a cylinder form, so we're just going to curve around this edge just like shading a cylinder. And I hope it's clear to everyone, I'm not doing this. If you shade back and forth with your pencil, you can't get this to work right. I'm shading from the dark towards the light like this, and every stroke of my pencil, my tip of the pencil is lifting off the page, and you see how that just wants to create this natural gradation from dark to light. And you can't do it if you're still in the habit of shading back and forth. It's just not going to work the same. So when you were a kid coloring with crayons, you probably got in the habit of shading back and forth quickly because you're impatient to make the sky blue or the tree green, and you get into bad habits. But we're trying to learn a more controlled use of the instrument. So these are my sharpening strokes, just like on a cylinder. We don't expect any reflected light on this surface because there's nothing, no place for it to reflect from. And we are going to add a little bit of white to the surface because we can see that, you know, this is, we're calling this our background is the color of our paper. So we do need to do some sharpening strokes along this edge but I'm using very light pressure because we don't want this light to compete with our highlight. So we use like the lightest possible pressure, and then we do some curving strokes to create this transition, and we're transitioning from the light side to the dark side like this. Now, if there are things you don't like about your construction, your proportions, like I said, this is not the time to be worrying about that. At this point, just commit to what you have, and just keep in mind that next time you might need to allow a little more time to get your construction accurate before you do this second shading. So here we want to be aware that what we're drawing is a form shadow that's transitioning into a little cast shadow. And then the cast shadow is dropping over this little shelf right here. And there's a little sliver of it that's passing over the shoulder of this form, like that. And it would be very easy for a lot of people to miss what's happening here, but you see how this little shelf is in shadow right till about here, and from here on it's in light. A lot of beginners are going to call that all the same value, but in fact it's only in shadow to about here. Here I'm using my vertical stroke for this little vertical surface, and then a little bit of a sharpening stroke on the top and the bottom. And then it becomes a halftone. So the continuation of this form is not with black, but it's by putting white on either side of it like this. And a lot of beginners are just going to want to put black all the way across, but that would not be correct because we don't allow the black to go anywhere that is receiving direct light. And this little shelf here is receiving direct light. On here we have a pair of highlights. We've got an external highlight where this form peaks. And notice I'm creating it with little tiny vertical strokes because it's a slightly soft edge and I want to get the light to kind of turn across the edge. And then we have a little internal highlight here, again with very small vertical strokes, and that highlight is where we hit highlights often at corners. This is an outside corner and this is an inside corner. This highlight is more diffuse because it's a softer turn, and this highlight is a little more sharp because it's a sharper turn. And then we have not a highlight, but a little bit of a strong light going across this form all the way till it hits that cast shadow. And because these highlights are standing out a little too much, I'm going to go back to my first shading direction and just unify my lights with very, very faint pressure and just kind of pull that together, because I don't want the highlights just shouldn't be standing out quite that much. Alrighty, so here I'm noticing a little asymmetry, so I'm going to just pull this shoulder up a little higher and sharpen this edge. I'm sort of breaking my own rule of not making corrections during the final shading process, but so this is just like shading a sphere. See, your lines are gonna follow the form, and then as they move towards this center, they're gonna be moving straight up and down, and then as we get around to the left, they're gonna curve the other way like this. You know you're getting somewhere in drawing when it starts to feel like sculpting, when it starts to feel like you're just, especially with white, it's a very satisfying feeling to feel like you're adding white and you're building form. Because the white gives you a very immediate sense of pulling these forms towards you. And you don't get that when you're only shading with a dark instrument, because in order to get those highlights, you have to shade all around them. And that's a very different feeling. This is much more natural and immediate. And even if your drawings aren't perfect, I hope you're having a little bit of that experience. And here's another place where my shadow map is a little strong, so I'm just going to lighten that. And now we're coming back. It's just like we did up here with these curving strokes. But I'm going to be very careful to use my lightest pressure right here, because there's a lot of reflected light. There's more reflected light on this form than this one, because it's closer to the ground. Remember, our reflected light is coming mainly from the ground. And that's a hard thing to get used to. You'll notice that the form shadow on this orb is darkest up here near the top and lightest down here near the bottom. And a lot of people have a hard time getting used to that idea, because they just want to, they think the further down you go, the darker the shadows should get, and it's actually the opposite. You want to get used to having your darkest shadows up near the top here, and gradually getting lighter as they come down into that reflected light. I'm making minor adjustments of the form just for symmetry, but no major placement revisions, no proportion revisions. So you'll notice in my drawing right now, this reflected light doesn't look bright enough. And a lot of beginners make the mistake of then saying, well, it's got to be brighter, and they'll actually take the white pencil and add reflected light. But reflected light is entirely, you're just, the simple rule that we're following is we're not allowed to use white in our shadows, and reflected light is part of the shadow. So the way you make it look bright enough is by darkening around it. And I'm going to put this curved plane underneath it, pressing just a little harder. And you see that immediately that reflected light looks more brilliant. And if I darken a little more through the top of my core shadow, it's going to look bright enough. You'll also notice that we're getting much less reflected light over here because the cast shadow here, which we haven't really darkened yet, is blocking the light that would otherwise be bouncing up into that shadow. So we really don't have much reflected light on this side of the form above the cast shadow. So here I'm cross-hatching. I'm using some sharpening strokes that are crossing over the transition strokes I used before. And I'm fading from this darker part of the form shadow into the more reflected, where the reflected light gets brighter, like that. So this little lip here is a vertical plane that's pretty dark, and it wraps around the form up to about here. It disappears behind the form, and it gets a little wider towards the middle. And there's a tiny bit of reflected light under it, and then this form is basically another cylinder. Some sharpening strokes at the outside edge. And here again, my shadow map needs to be erased slightly. Now here you'll see me, I'm shading from right to left. I'm not shading into the halftone, I'm shading the other direction because this is a cast shadow edge, so it's much sharper than these form shadow edges. So I'm still shading perpendicular to the edge, but I'm shading away from the halftone instead of towards the halftone. That's not even something a strategy that I was conscious of. I just sort of noticed myself doing it and thought I would point that out. And here's where this cast shadow falls over this lip again. And you really want to make it clear your shadow's coming to here, going down a little, and then it's curving around this way. While you catch up, I'm going back to here. I'm noticing that my lights feel a little splotchy. That often happens. And I can recover just by going back to the first shading direction and unifying them with a very faint first shading. That kind of pulls that whole zone together. Okay, so this whole side is in light, so I really probably should have hit that with a little first shading. You'll notice that if we zoom in, you notice how the form is really not, the edge disappears here. Everyone agree with me? Like, you can't really see that edge. So in your drawing, you want to let it disappear also. Don't try to make it any clearer in your drawing than it is in the photograph. Because if you try, what you're going to do is you're going to outline it, and it's going to look artificial, because anytime there's an edge where the value is exactly the same on both sides, the edges kind of disappear like that, and you should let it disappear in your drawing as well. Here we've got this little outside highlight. I'm going to do it the same way, although it's a little bit sharper, so I might let my pencil follow the line a little. And under it, here's another little inside highlight. And that's a pretty sharp one. And then out here, there is a very soft outside highlight. So I'm going to create that by hatching across. Like that. And finally, we have some darks mixed up in here, mainly on the ground plane. So here's the first time in the whole drawing where we're going to let ourselves press pretty hard and do some sharpening of the cast shadow. Like this. And because our cast shadow is on the ground, our second shading direction is going to be completely horizontal. Just like this. And we're getting this edge as sharp as we can without any sharpening strokes. So we're staying very focused, but you'll notice that it's the sharpening stroke on the right side of the shadow makes it much crisper than the non-sharpening strokes on the left side. And as we wrap around here, this cast shadow on this upward facing surface is also quite dark because it's getting no reflected light. And same with this surface here. And again, inside the shadows, the surfaces that face up are going to receive the least light. And there's a very subtle kind of like overlap between this form and this one. And here my shadow map was nice and faint, so I don't have to erase it. I'm just sort of trying to stay as much as I can inside the lines, but not following the edges, just staying inside the lines, but only using these horizontal strokes. And the beauty of this technique is that, and the logic of it, is that you'll notice that where the shadow moves down towards us, the outline of the shadow is fuzzier. So we're naturally getting a softer edge here. And then as the shadow curves around, cutting across our field of vision, it gets tighter. And so these horizontal strokes are going to tighten it. So you don't really, if you use the right shading direction, you don't really have to think about your sharpness too much. It's just going to sort of take care of itself. But as soon as you start throwing other directions into your shading on a cast shadow like this, it's going to mess you up. So you want to be very disciplined. Now the reason this looks a little weird right now is because I haven't shaded the ground at all, except with that first shading. So we're going to continue the horizontal shading on the ground the same way that we did on the shadow. And you see how now it makes a lot more sense. Now it's starting to read like a horizontal plane, which is what we want. But I'm not pressing hard again because none of these lights on the ground should compete with our highlights on the form. And here where the cast shadow is really sharp, we can bring our whites right up to the edge of it, just about touching it, but never overlapping. We never want the white and the black to mix together. So one of the most rewarding phases of the drawing for me is we're now going to do some sharpening strokes on the ground around the object. And we want to avoid the temptation of making these too bright. So I sharpen my pencil and I'm using my lightest pressure, but I'm filling in that light so it comes right up against the shadow with sharpening strokes. So these strokes are following the form like that. But then we don't want it to look outlined, and so we transition from the sharpening strokes into more horizontal strokes. So that starts to give us a sense of this light surface passing behind the shadow with a very sharp edge in between. And I'm going to do that all the way up. But the key here is such a light touch with the pencil, because if you press too hard, it's just going to look like a white outline around the shape, which is not what we're after. And we're going to do a little bit of the same thing on the other side. Right around here. And this white in the background is what's going to bring out this edge where this halftone meets this light. And then transitioning again into the horizontal strokes. Now up here where the light is passing behind a highlight, we don't need to do the sharpening strokes. We already did them on here. We don't want it, so we're sort of cheating a little, and we're letting the background maybe go a quarter step darker right around the edge to bring that edge out. That's an aesthetic choice. A lot of artists, if you're a true realist, you wouldn't want to do that, but I'm just trying to describe the forms, and I'm letting this get a little darker behind this edge. And down here where we talked about it being the same value here and here, we're going to let that edge completely disappear. And you'll notice, as I explain, I'm vignetting, which means I'm doing a study of this object. I'm not doing composition, so I'm not shading white all the way to the edges of my paper. I'm just shading enough white to show where the object, I'm just bringing my whites up behind the shape and then fading out as we move away from it. I'm just doing a few finishing touches here. And I guess that'll do it for this demonstration. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.